Hello, this is Brennan Scott. This is my video for the fiscal cliff. This is for the Law and Public Policy class for IUPUI, class 376. This video is meant to explain the fiscal cliff, what it was, what caused it, what were the results of it, what should have been done, cause and effect, etc. Now, before I get into some of the details of the fiscal cliff, to kind of put everything into perspective, what I'd like to do is explain that basically, and this might not come as a shock to everybody, but the United States cannot balance its budget and pay its bills. It's really no different than any household not setting a monthly or an annual budget and just kind of spending outrageously on its own without matching its income to debt ratio. The United States has the same problem. We typically on a regular basis spend more than we take in. Now, what is the fiscal cliff? To give a brief history, the federal deficit is essentially the way that we explain as a country how much more money we spend on an annual basis than what we take in on an annual basis. Typically, we're running about $1 trillion a year deficit, meaning we are spending $1 trillion more a year than what we're taking in. Now, back in 2009, when President Barack Obama took office, the budget deficit for the United States, or the total federal deficit, was around $11.7 trillion. As of 2013, we're typically running about $16.6 trillion. So the federal deficit has increased almost 50% since the time that Barack Obama has taken office. So taking all that into consideration, essentially what that means is the United States has a giant credit card that we keep spending and charging things on, not paying the bill off on a regular basis, and continually increasing the limit. So, with that being said, what is the fiscal cliff? Fiscal cliff was a series of tax hikes and spending cuts to go into effect on January 1st, 2013 through a budget sequestration as a result of the Budget Control Act of 2011. Now, if we would have gone over the fiscal cliff, meaning that nothing would have been done or Congress would have acted, this would allegedly have had higher unemployment and a mild recession with an economic slowdown would have taken place. Now, what is sequestration? Sequestration, specifically budget sequestration, is something that is a law that takes place where it forcibly limits the size of the federal budget, meaning that we take all discretion, not all of it, but a lot of discretion out of the budget and how it's controlled. So there are caps, artificial caps kind of put into place. Now, appropriations legislation, when appropriations legislation exceed the budget caps, equal spending cuts across the board take place. Now, as I mentioned, currently, as of 2013, the entire federal deficit budget is about $16.6 trillion, running out from about $11.7 trillion back in 2009. Now, if essentially when we got to January 1st, if nothing would have occurred, automatic triggers would have taken place where there would have been approximately a 19.63 increase in revenue through various taxes, as well as a 0.25% spending cut across the board in the federal spending, which isn't a lot, but that's what they ended up doing. Now, what caused the fiscal cliff? Essentially, the Budget Control Act of 2011, enacted on August 2nd, 2011, to be more specific. Essentially, what that did was address the possible sovereign default of the United States on August 3rd, 2011, basically meaning that the United States would have been deemed insolvent, we wouldn't have been able to pay our bills, foreign countries would have stopped lending us money, etc. At that time, to give a brief history, the federal debt ceiling, meaning the borrowing limit on the federal government, was set at $12.5 trillion in 2009, went up to $14.5 trillion in 2010. Essentially, we kept raising the debt limit, meaning that we kept extending the limit on our United States credit card. Now, the debt ceiling, just to kind of put everything in perspective, back in 1981 when Ronald Reagan was in office, was about $1 trillion. So we keep increasing that over and over and over and over again without addressing the longer term problem. As of May 2011, approximately 40% of the money that the United States used to pay its bills was borrowed from foreign countries. Now, the Budget Control Act of 2011 did several things, but first and foremost, it created a committee of 12, comprised of 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans, that were essentially in charge of finding a way for the federal government to balance its budget. Now, what ended up happening on January 1st, 2013, instead of us going over the fiscal cliff, was the American Taxpayer Relief Act of 2012 took into place, which means It's it was a short-term fix, essentially, meaning that it was something put into place as a crutch or a band-aid to take care of the longer problem and essentially kind of kick the can down the road, meaning we didn't really solve the overall cause of our budget crisis. What it did was it eliminated the revenue side while increasing the overall federal deficit to a higher level. The expiration of the provisions of the Bush tax cuts took place, meaning that tax rates or elements of the Bush tax cuts stayed in place. Some were expired. Essentially, the current tax rates in 2012 stayed in place for anyone making over $400,000 a year, $450,000 for couples. Everything above that was raised. Some of the other provisions of the American Taxpayer Relief Act of 2012 was it capped the overall top rate of taxes at 39.6% for federal, had a 20% capital gains tax, 39.6% for dividends, and also had a 40% taxable rate for estate taxes over $5 million, and then also made a change in the Social Security taxes where it went from 4.2% to 6.2%, or a 2% increase for the overall revenue of everyone in the country, everyone paying taxes, everyone receiving a paycheck. Now, should have anything been done different on January the 1st? My opinion is yes. I would have done nothing, meaning that we would have gone over the fiscal cliff. What that would have meant in the long run is we would have had a lower deficit, a lower debt, lower spending, and some higher taxes. Over a 10-year period, if we would have gone over the fiscal cliff where nothing would have occurred, there would have been a projected $7.1 trillion reduction in the overall federal deficit. Now, when we're talking in terms of 16.6 total, it's almost about between 45 and 50% reduction of the total federal deficit as it is now. Now, when we look back to when Bill Clinton was in office, we were running a budget surplus, meaning we were actually taking in more money than we were spending. Somehow we just can't seem to figure that out since then. Now, what remains to be addressed? Because as I mentioned, the American Taxpayer Relief Act of 2012 was only a temporary fix. Well, the U.S. debt ceiling was suspended essentially until May 19th of 2013. It was suspended at 16.4 trillion. Obviously, we've exceeded that right now. On February the 4th, the No Budget, No Pay Act was put into place, meaning that if nothing had been figured out by May 19th or May 18th, on May 19th, all the salaries of our public servants, Senate and the Congress and the House, would be suspended, which I don't think is a bad idea, to be honest with you. Also, there have been proposals for a constitutional amendment for future balanced budgets. Now, again, give it a little bit of history, we have not passed a balanced budget, or passed a budget, for that matter, in the entire time that Barack Obama has been in office. Now, what should have been done? Pass a balanced budget. Novel idea. Perhaps let budget sequestration continue. Now, up on March the 3rd, 2013, actually I believe it was March the 1st, there were some automatic cuts that did kind of go into place. $85 billion for discretionary spending. Discretionary spending for our entire budget, it's about a 64-36 split, meaning 64% of our total federal budget is mandatory spending, 36% is discretionary spending. We put into effect $85 billion in mandatory tax cuts over a 7-month period over that discretionary portion, over that 1/3 portion for the next 7 months. So in other words, from March until September of 2013. As a greater piece of the pie, we're talking about 1 to 2% of the total discretionary spending would be put into place over several different departments. Now, the overall projected budget deficit for 2013 would be a revenue of $2.9 trillion and expenditures of about $3.8 trillion. So like I said earlier, we're running about a $900 billion to $1 trillion budget deficit on a regular basis. The biggest chunks of the mandatory spending have to do with Social Security and Medicare, but we're not talking about cutting those entitlement programs. We're talking about cutting discretionary spending, national parks, museums, some defense, things like that. So essentially, to kind of recap everything, the United States cannot balance its budget. Maybe I'm oversimplifying it, but it seems a lot easier than it really is to do in actuality. Very commonplace for Congress and the federal government to put things off until the last second. As I mentioned, the Budget Control Act of 2011 was put into place almost a year and a half before the fiscal cliff occurred. We waited literally until the last minute, the last day, to do anything about it. As the budget deal, the American Taxpayer Act, was put into place on January 1st and backdated to midnight to prevent the us, the United States, going over the fiscal cliff. So essentially, that's my summation. Hopefully, and I'm optimistic about this, we'll be able to figure this out, balance the budget, perhaps institute a constitutional amendment for forced balance budgets for future generations, and stop borrowing money that we can't spend. As a wise man once said, the problem with socialism is you eventually run out of everyone else's money. This is Brennan Scott, the end.